Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for a presentation on key findings from the March-April survey of Asian American and Pacific Islander adults. I'm Karthik Ramakrishnan, the founder and executive director of AAPI Data, and today I am thrilled to welcome U.S. Congresswoman Grace Meng, who is chair of CAPAC, the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus. Congresswoman and Chair Meng is serving her 7th term in the U.S. House of Representatives, where she represents New York's 6th congressional district. Her district is located entirely in New York City's borough of Queens, including West, Central, and Northeast Queens. She's the first and only Asian American member of Congress from New York State and the first female Congress member from Queens since former vice presidential nominee Geraldine Ferraro. Welcome, Chair Meng.
Thank you so much, Karthik, for the kind introduction, and thank you to AAPI Data for presenting earlier this year to the Democratic Caucus on the Hill. Hi, everyone. I'm Congresswoman Grace Meng, and as was heard, the chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, or known as CAPAC. Thank you also to the teams at AAPI Data, APIAVote, AAJA, and NCAPA for convening this series to discuss the critical issues facing our AANHPI communities at this moment. Our communities have been living with so much uncertainty in the last 100 days. Since taking office, the current administration has taken action to cut Medicaid, revoke birthright citizenship, close the Department of Education, eliminate language access, and implement across-the-board tariffs that raise costs for families and small businesses, to name just a few items. As the current administration decimates the federal government's ability to serve and support AANHPI businesses, nonprofits, communities, and families, CAPAC's role remains unchanged. It is our job and my role as chair to protect our communities from harmful policies and to ensure Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders have space at the decision-making table. The most recent survey findings that AAPI Data released show that most AANHPI adults disapprove of how Trump has handled major policy issues, including the economy, trade, education, and diversity and inclusion policies. It is the duty of elected officials to listen to our constituents and address the needs they are raising. Unfortunately, this administration has shown flagrant disregard for the voices of the American people and continue to implement reckless policies that will have devastating consequences for our future. CAPAC is committed to fighting against unlawful, unjust, and reckless policies that have the potential to harm our communities. Recent data indicates 66% of AAPI Trump voters oppose the recent tariff increases. I've heard countless stories from mom and pop businesses in my district who are scared about their ability to survive the economic impacts of these reckless tariffs. Instead of focusing on protecting the backbone of our economy, the administration is continuing to institute policies that are increasing prices, disrupting supply chains, and making it hard for individuals and families to afford the basic costs of groceries. Just last week, CAPAC member Congressman Goldman and I held a press conference with local Asian American-owned small businesses in New York's Chinatown to demand an end to the president's trade war and call for the resources our small businesses desperately need to survive. CAPAC also remains extremely concerned over the administration's actions to disregard the 14th Amendment and eliminate birthright citizenship. Earlier this month, I led an amicus brief along with over 200 of my House Democrats colleagues against President Trump's unlawful executive order to revoke birthright citizenship and eliminate the core principle that has allowed millions of our community members to become U.S. citizens. This comes 127 years since the landmark U.S. v. Wong Kim Ark decision that affirmed birthright citizenship to anyone born in our country, including those born to immigrant parents. We continue to monitor Trump and Elon Musk's careless and reckless decimation of the federal government, including many services for our community members with limited English proficiency or LEP. Last week, I led a letter with KPAC Chair Emerita Judy Chu and over 50 of our House Democratic colleagues demanding President Trump reverse his decision that weakens language accessibility protections within our federal government. The Trump administration must be held accountable and provide information on how the rescission of Executive Order 13166, a policy that has been in place for the past 25 years that requires agencies and recipients of federal funding to provide meaningful language accessibility, will impact LEP communities. I'm deeply concerned about disruptions in access to federal programs for the more than 25 million people across the nation who are limited English proficient. All Americans deserve to access the services and resources their taxes are paying for without barriers based solely on language proficiency. That's why I'm so grateful for the coalition of partners we have here today and for your continued advocacy to ensure our communities are protected. The survey, the numbers, and the stories that you provide will help us to be stronger advocates amongst our colleagues and in Congress and to the White House. Thank you again to AAPI Data, APIAVote, AHAA, and ANCAPA again for your tremendous work and advocacy. And I look forward to continuing our partnership to ensure that our community's voices are heard and translated into affordable policy in Congress. Thanks so much for your work.
Thank you so much, Rep. Meng, and we are grateful for your leadership and those of others to make sure that policies being debated and ultimately passed in Washington, D.C. reflect the interests and needs of our communities. With that, I will turn it over to Sarah Sadhwani, who is MC of the event today, who will introduce the rest of the speakers that'll come later, and then she'll toss it back to me. Sarah, welcome.
Perfect. Great. Thanks so much, Karthik. And thank you to Congresswoman Meng for being here today. That's super exciting and inspiring. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. The Voices of AAPI briefings are incredibly important resource of data and insights for our communities, particularly in these timely moments where so many policy and social issues are coming to the forefront. I would like to thank, of course, our partners, AAPI Data, but also APIAVote, Asian American Journalists Association, and ANCAPA for today's briefing, and the Associated Press and NORC for their ongoing partnership. We are so fortunate to have all of your collaboration. As Karthik mentioned, my name's Sarah Sadhwani. I'll be your MC for today. I'm a political science professor at Pomona College, but also a senior researcher here at AAPI Data. With us today, we are very fortunate to have Greg Orton, the National Director for ANCAPA, the National Council of Asian Pacific Americans, as well as Bob Sakaniwa, Director of Policy and Advocacy at APIAVote. And they're going to be sharing their thoughts on the data that we're going to be presented with today. You're going to get a ton of information today, but don't worry, you don't need to be writing everything down vigorously. All of these facts and figures are available on our website and will be shared with you. You can always check out our data at aapidata.com. Throughout the Zoom, participants are going to be muted, but please feel free to pose questions in the Zoom chat, and I'll do my best to moderate through all of those questions. In addition, if you haven't already, drop your name and affiliation so that we have a sense of who's here on the call with us today. And now I'd like to bring back to the microphone Karthik Ramakrishnan, our founder and executive director of AAPI Data, to review the many findings of this survey. Karthik.
Thank you, Sarah. Okay, folks, as Sarah mentioned, there's actually a fair number of findings that I'm going to be going through. But you can find these data from today, as well as a curation of data from the past year on our website. And we know we have a lot of information. We try to make it as easily accessible as possible. And but often people don't know, what survey did this question get asked? Well, if you go to apiadata.com and you click on by the numbers, you will see this Voices of Community post that has information about immigration, not only from the latest survey, but from prior surveys. Has information about education, not only from the latest survey, but prior surveys, and so on. So please take a look. As always, we're happy to follow up if you have any questions on information you don't see on our website. Next slide, please. So the key findings from the survey we just released this month include the following. One is that most AAPIs disapprove of President Trump's handling of key policy issues. And the ones that receive the most disapproval are the ones that might otherwise be seen as a strong suit, including the economy and trade negotiations with other countries. Climate change, as we approach Earth Day, is also another issue where the Trump administration has high disapproval ratings. Another finding is that more than half of API adults think that President Trump is focusing on the wrong priorities, and only 18% think that he's focused on the right priorities. The rest indicate that there is a mix of right and wrong priorities. We also see that APIs overwhelmingly oppose the elimination of key federal agencies, including the Department of Education, the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, and USAID. We also find that API adults trust Democrats more than Republicans on key issues, but are divided on which party they trust more on issues like immigration, economy, and inflation. On immigration, we see that support for deporting all immigrants living in the country illegally remains divided, but that API adults are opposed to specific deportation tactics as they involve sensitive populations and sensitive contexts. And finally, about half of API adults oppose eliminating the constitutional right to birthright citizenship for children born in the United States. Next slide, please. So first, looking at how President Trump is handling various issues instead of just asking a generic approve, disapprove, we asked in context of particular issue areas. And these issues that we had flagged include those that API adults had signaled were important issues looking ahead in the coming year. So we asked that in December 2024. And what we find is that disapproval is highest. First of all, there's disapproval across the board. There is no issue on which the Trump administration receives approval. And that's important to note because even though there had been a shift towards greater support for President Trump in 2024 than we had seen in 2020 and in 2016, this does not mean that President Trump has a mandate among API adults when it comes to key issues. And particularly on the issue of the economy and trade negotiations, we see 71% disapproval. Reminder, this was conducted in early March before the latest round of tariffs and economic turmoil that the country has seen. Next slide. API adults also think that President Trump is largely focusing on the wrong priorities, so 55%, whereas only 18% say that he's mostly focusing on the right priorities. Another 18% say about an even mix. There is a partisan divide, but even among API Republicans, a bare majority, 50%, say that he is mostly focusing on the right priorities. Next slide. We also asked about Elon Musk, who we haven't heard much about in recent weeks. But most API adults, when we asked them in March, believe that Musk has too much influence on the federal government, 76%. And among Republicans, you see about even split in terms of whether he has too much influence or about the right amount of influence. Next slide. We also asked about the elimination of particular departments, and we find opposition to the elimination of all the departments that we asked about, the USAID, Department of Education, and the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau. When it comes to CFPB and DOE, over 2/3 of API adults oppose the elimination of these agencies. Next slide. We also see that most API adults oppose eliminating federal funding related to diversity and equity programs, including eliminating federal funding for K-12 schools that teach about the ongoing impact of slavery and racism in America. This pertains to an executive order that President Trump had issued several weeks ago that target K-12 programs, K-12 schools that teach about racism in America. We also find opposition, 2/3 of API adults who are opposed to eliminating initiatives that seek to broaden access to federal resources, policies, and programs for API communities. So this, for example, would include programs like the White House Initiative on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders, which the Trump administration eliminated a couple of months ago. Next slide. And then finally, when it comes to which party they trust more to handle various issues, we see a split on issues like immigration, the economy, and inflation. But on all other issues, Democrats enjoy a clear advantage, including foreign policy issues, housing costs, education, healthcare, and climate change. Next slide. So we'll just go a little bit of a deeper dive into immigration policy. And what we find is that API adults are split on the issue of deportations, much as they were in December 2024 when we asked the question. So it's about even split about those who favor or oppose deporting all immigrants living in the country illegally. When we asked about particular contexts, including deporting all immigrants living in the country illegally, even if it means that they will be separated from their children who are US citizens, we find that a majority oppose that. We also find that a majority oppose immigration enforcement on people while they're at church or other places of worship. And we find that 60% oppose arresting people who are in the country illegally while they're in hospitals. Next slide. By contrast, we find significant support for deporting those who are in the country illegally that have been convicted of a violent crime, as well as those who've been convicted of nonviolent crimes such as shoplifting or burglary. So it's important for us to take stock of where public opinion is, including public opinion of API adults at this point in time. From my observation over the last several years, and certainly over the last decade, more conservative opinion in our community. And the Associated Press ran a story which showed significant age-based differences, where you saw more progressive opinion or liberal opinion among younger Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, and more conservative opinion among older APIs, including those who are first-generation immigrants. Next slide. We find that an overwhelming majority of APIs want to ensure humane treatment for immigrants who are being sent back to their home country. And this has been in the news quite a bit, including deportations not only to Latin America and other countries instead of directly to countries of origin, also detainees being held in Guantanamo Bay, but also inhumane conditions of people being deported to India and other countries of origin. Next slide. Finally, when it comes to birthright citizenship, we find that about a half of APIs oppose the elimination of the constitutional right to birthright citizenship. I'll note that I was a bit surprised by these findings. I would have expected these numbers to be higher, including when we asked specifically about birthright citizenship as it pertains to the children born in the US to parents who are here on temporary work or student visas. Suggests that there's a lot that we might need to do in terms of increasing community awareness about the implications of birthright citizenship within our communities. Next slide. We had a few questions on the environment, and especially given that we are in Earth Week, it's worth looking at this. What we find is that most API adults have experienced at least one severe weather event in the last 5 years. And this is especially true of APIs living in the state of California that account for about 1/3 of the national API population. Next slide. We also find that most API adults believe that climate change already has or will have a major impact in their lifetime, And if you look at the survey report as well as the crosstabs on our website, you will see varying levels of support for policies intended to help people that have experienced various consequences of climate change, including weather disasters. Next slide. So next, I'm just going to go through a few deeper dives in places that are interesting, where we find some differences by ethnicity, by party ID, age, and nativity. What we find, for example, on Trump approval of the economy, we see disapproval across the board, but we do see slightly higher approval on the economy among Filipino Americans. And this is a pattern you'll see elsewhere, where depending on the issue, but generally you see higher levels of support or lower levels of disapproval among Filipino Americans. Next slide. When it comes to the economy, not surprisingly, you see a pretty strong partisan tilt, with Republicans more likely to approve of the Trump administration's, of Donald Trump's handling of the economy, whereas Democrats and independents disapprove. What's also interesting is when it comes to younger voters or younger adults. There's been a lot of talk about younger adults among communities of color shifting pretty significantly over to President Trump during the 2024 election. We didn't see a big shift among Asian Americans, but a modest one. But what we see in terms of handling of the economy, which in many instances was a motivating issue, we see that only 13% of 18 to 29-year-olds approve of Donald Trump's handling of the economy. Next slide. We also asked which party can be trusted to do a better job on the economy. And as I'd mentioned before, it's about evenly split. But for some communities, we see it going in the other direction. So it's worth paying attention to that. So for example, among Filipinos, the split remains. But among Korean Americans and Vietnamese Americans, slightly more saying that the Democrats can be trusted to do a better job of handling the economy. Next slide. When it comes to the elimination of the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, we see widespread opposition, and the only significant support, if you can even call it that, is among Republican API adults, but even there, only 37% favor the elimination of the CFPB. Next slide. Looking next at immigration, we see that 42% approve, 58% disapprove. And this is where, when we look at immigration, it's a complex issue. On some indicators, like overall approval, you'll see groups like Indian Americans and Chinese Americans less likely to disapprove, if you will. But when it comes to particular policies, you see greater disapproval. Next slide. We also see which party can be trusted to do a better job on immigration, and we see a split here that runs across the board. But interestingly, even though it's within the margin of error, you see that for Asian Indians and for Chinese Americans, they trust the Republicans to do a better job on immigration than Democrats. Next slide. When it comes to deporting all immigrants living in the United States illegally, you don't see too much differences here that are statistically significant, although you do see lower levels among Japanese Americans and among Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders. Next slide. Now, when you ask about the separation of children, you see lower levels of support. But interestingly, among Filipino Americans, you see that 34% still favor deportations, even if it means that children would be separated from their parents. And among Vietnamese Americans, 32%. We also find that men are more likely than women to approve or to favor deporting all immigrants living in the country illegally, even if it means that they would be separated from their children. Next slide. Finally, with respect to birthright citizenship, we have a few questions here that are worth digging into when it comes to the topic of immigration. We don't see too much with respect to differences by ethnicity, although it is notable here that Filipino and Japanese Americans are more likely to favor eliminating the constitutional right to birthright citizenship. So you see close to 40% of Filipinos, as well as 40% of Japanese Americans, support the elimination of the constitutional right to birthright citizenship for children born in the United States to parents who are here illegally. Next slide. We also asked about birthright citizenship for children born in the US to parents who are here on temporary work or student visas. We know that Indian Americans and Chinese Americans are more likely to be here in the country on temporary work visas or student visas, and you see less support among these populations and greater opposition to the elimination of birthright citizenship. But among Filipinos, however, you see that close to a third continue to support this policy as it continue to support the elimination of birthright citizenship, even if it applies to temporary people here on legal visas, right? Temporary work visas or student visas. Next slide. We also asked about family visas, right? It wasn't just about policies as they pertain to unauthorized immigrants or on birthright citizenship. And generally speaking, we don't see much support, but again, among Filipino Americans, you see that about a quarter, 27%, favor reducing the number of family-sponsored visas available for immigrants living in the country legally to bring their relatives to the US. Now, this is important to note because Filipino Americans are among those who have some of the longest backlogs when it comes to family visa sponsorship. So it indicates a potential disconnect between what the realities of immigration sponsorship are and perhaps where public opinion is, which not only matters based on the lived experience, but also how these issues play through when it comes to partisanship and media coverage. Next slide. We also asked about reducing the number of temporary work visas, such as H-1B visas available for foreign workers. And generally speaking, we don't see much support. And importantly, to the extent that one might think that there'd be greater support for this among those who face labor market competition, say among younger adults, we actually see greater opposition to the elimination of reduction, sorry, not the elimination of temporary work visas such as H-1B visas. Let's go to the next slide. So looking beyond immigration, on USAID, we see some ethnic differences that emerge, greater support for the elimination of USAID among Chinese Americans and Filipino Americans, and a lot less support for the elimination of USAID among Indian Americans, Japanese Americans, and Korean Americans. Next slide. When it comes to eliminating the US Department of Education, we see opposition across the board, regardless of one's ethnicity or gender. Next slide. And we find greater opposition to the elimination of Department of Education among young API adults, those age 18 to 29. And not surprisingly, we also see greater opposition to eliminating the Department of Education among Democrats and independents, although even among Republicans, only 37% favor elimination of the US Department of Education. Next slide. When it comes to eliminating federal funding for K-12 schools that teach about the ongoing impact of slavery and racism in America, we see that this is largely a partisan issue and that age does not matter as much on this issue as it did for immigration. And then finally, on the last slide, as it pertains to education, on which party is trusted to do a better job on the issue of education, a strong advantage for Democrats across the board, regardless of race and ethnicity, and regardless of age and nativity. So with that, I'll turn it back to Sarah, who will moderate a conversation with our partners.
Great. Thanks so much, Karthik, for laying out all of this fantastic information. So much to dig into here. We're going to have a conversation with Bob and Greg and Karthik and get some of their reactions to it. But for those of you here joining us, please feel free to leave us a question, and before the end of the hour, we will do our best to get to all of the questions. You can either drop it in the chat, or there's a Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen where you can put it, and we'll do our best to keep an eye on that. There's so much here, and I certainly want to dig into some of the findings that we see on immigration, climate as well, to some extent, given that it is Earth Week. Would love to take a little bit of a focus there. But before we do, I really want to take a peek at one of the things that stuck out to me, which appears to be this sort of trust gap, if you will. We see that there's strong disapproval across so many of the areas of the Trump agenda from within our community, and yet there's not necessarily a whole lot of trust that Democrats are going to do any better on particularly on those key issues that AAPIs care about around the economy, around immigration. I want to start with you, Greg, from the perspective of an AAPI serving organization. How are you seeing this play out on the ground with many of the organizations and folks that you all work with, when you have folks who are frustrated with the Republican agenda, but also not convinced that Democrats could do anything better? Where do they turn? Where do they turn for leadership, or do they start to tune out? And what are you going to do about it?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah, and good afternoon, everybody. I appreciate the question, and it is a tricky one. I was also, I wouldn't say surprised by the findings, but it was definitely illuminating, right? It's always good for, civil rights organizations, community organizations to make sure they're staying grounded in the reality of what the community is saying, right? I'm not saying that community opinion or public opinion should necessarily drive an organization. We have, certainly the ability to shape public opinion, but we need to be informed by it. And so, to me, it's very telling that, our community has less trust in certain parties on certain issues. But I think on immigration and certainly the economy, we saw this play out in the last election. I think it's a confirmation that these are two issues that are top of mind for, quite honestly, most of the country here. And, we see lots of news stories, certainly on the economy side, with everything that's occurring with uh, pending trade wars. And we can get into the sort of the opining of sort of who's at fault here. But the reality is, the first 100 days of any administration is really that opportunity to set the record straight on what the priorities are. I'd also remind folks, for context, this is the second term for President Trump, so this is not something he is new to. And so for me, as we approach that first 100 days, it seems pretty clear that uh, his priorities may be his, and as opposed to what the country wants, or certainly what the API community wants. And so I would say, for everyone here, we certainly want to make sure we're paying attention to this data. We don't want to necessarily give up our values, but we have work to do when it comes to how we engage our community on immigration. I think the economy question probably is one I suspect we'll see continued shifts over time. Surveys are incredibly important, but they capture a snapshot in a moment of time. There's real-time updates happening even today as the stock market struggles, as trade negotiations continue. But those are all big, big terms that we don't think about. On the ground, communities are hurting, right? Small businesses are struggling to stay open because the cost of operations are going up. Families are struggling to, meet ends meet because just the cost of goods that they want to put in front of their families are getting more and more expensive. And so I think that is a perspective that I try to maintain. And I think this question on the economy is one that I hope we continue to sort of look at, because I suspect it'll change over time.
Yeah, that's so pertinent, I think, especially as so much is changing rapidly from the Trump administration. Let's see where these numbers fall in the next coming months, as the impact of many of these policies is actually felt on the ground more and more. Bob, I want to bring you into the conversation. What were some of your initial reactions to this seeming trust gap be coming out of the data?
That's a fantastic question, and I think one thing that being a national organization, as the three of us on this panel are part of, we have that disadvantage of being in Greg, in my case, in DC, and we really kind of see the bad things happening, in real time. And I think for it to play out, some of these policies to play out, in our communities, it takes a little longer for the impact to be felt, and so that in and of itself creates a bit of a gap. And we could be, the canaries in the coal mine, talking about the dangers to come. But until it starts, the impact starts to ripple out, we might sound alarmist. I think there are a lot of folks who feel like when they see Trump take action, if nothing else, they see somebody who's actually doing something and making things happen, and it's not really impacting them right away. So, unlike the more amorphous Democratic Party approach to things that people, don't even understand or know what the message is, it makes it hard to fight against somebody who's out there, who's got the bully pulpit, who's taking action. And I think people were at a point last year where they just wanted action. Now, is this what they wanted? It's up to our groups to kind of really explain and educate what these actions really are doing, and how it can potentially hurt people's futures if certain paths are taken. But in the meantime, it's incumbent upon us to really spend the time to understand where the community's at, and to bridge with education and kind of other messages. We were very lucky today to have somebody like Chairwoman Meng speak, because there are leaders in our communities who are fighting the fight and pushing back against some of these what we know will be harmful policies. But that the approach right now, our best ally right now is the federal court system, but that's not something that operates on the same at the same pace as some of these executive actions. So again, that creates another gap that education is needed to kind of fill. But I think the point here, I guess I'm making, is that education is the only way to bridge that gap of trust with the community. And so I think these surveys are vital in kind of laying the landscape out. But as Greg mentioned, things change. Even our discussion on what the survey finds regarding the economy is already not taking into account all the tariff fallout and kind of the whiplash we're getting from his continually changing his position on whether they're going to be implemented or not. So but it will eventually catch up, and when we do the survey again, I think we'll be in a much different place on a lot of this. But it's incumbent upon us to get us there.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what I'm hearing from both of you is that there's a whole lot of education that needs to be going on amongst many of the API community organizations that are out there. I want to switch gears just a little bit and delve into these immigration numbers a little bit more closely. I know there's a number of questions or concerns in the chat as well specific to this. Greg, why don't I start with you, because NCAPA, of course, has an extensive policy platform. Can you share a little bit about where NCAPA stands on immigration issues in general, and then respond to some of these really stunning results, particularly this finding that a third of respondents are favoring the elimination of birthright citizenship. I think this came as a shock to many of us as we're looking at this data. What are some of your thoughts on this finding in particular, but also in terms of how NCAPA approaches immigration as a policy arena?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. And I would say certainly across our 44 members, there is a range of perspectives on this big question, right? This overarching question of what immigration policy should look like. For decades, our community organizations, folks at the national level, many of you on the local and state level, have been fighting for immigration reform because we know fundamentally the system is broken, right? And when I say that, I want folks to think about this, right? Our community has arrived in this country and found ways to thrive in spite of an immigration system that was set up purposefully to make it much harder to do that. And we can track that across history. Now, having said that, I don't expect our coalition members necessarily to change our view on that and that desire to see reforms made in the immigration system. But certainly the findings of the survey data tells me that we need to take a step back and think about what our approach has been. In some ways, I do think it's community education and posing questions to folks to really reflect on the fact that, you know, if we're saying and signaling to the rest of the world, hey, we're okay with you coming to our country to work, to help benefit and build up this country, but when it comes to can we provide citizenship to you and your children, the answer is no. And that's a tough one for me. I think if the answer if our community continues to trend in a way where that's an unsort of defined answer, it means we have a lot of work to do. I think there's sort of this moral imperative for us, right? We always talk about sort of building a pipeline and opening doors and making sure we're not pulling the ladder up behind us. I'm not saying we're there, but I'm saying that certainly there's a larger proportion of our community that either needs to fully understand the implications of birthright citizenship or have arrived at this conclusion. And while I may disagree with them, I certainly respect that, you know, this is one of the beautiful things about America is where you can have opinions and differ. I think where we've gotten away from is the ability to actually debate these things and be in principled disagreement about it. And so, you know, we'll certainly take these findings back. I imagine there'll be a lot of sort of discussion amongst our members, and we'll see how it ultimately shapes kind of the next iteration of our policy platform, which we'll do in a couple of years. But yeah, I would agree. Like it's a surprising number, but it's also in some ways a good wake-up call.
Great, thank you so much, Bob. You know, I one of the things that really stayed with me from the 2024 election was the way that the Vice President Kamala Harris and of course the Democratic nominee had moderated her views on immigration, particularly from that time period when she served as the senator from California. As we dig deeper into this data, there's so many interesting revelations on immigration based on age, with older voters and the foreign-born wanting to be tougher on immigration. I'm really curious to get your thoughts from a voting perspective of how you anticipate, if you can anticipate at this point in time, but how you anticipate that this might play out at the ballot box by the time we get to the midterm elections. And in particular, how you anticipate that the candidates that might have sizable AAPIs in their districts might actually position themselves seeing these kinds of numbers. Do you anticipate candidates are going to moderate themselves on these issues, or on the flip side, might there be education from some of these candidates moving forward?
Yeah, that's again a great and tough question because you know, immigration is by many politicians kind of seen as the third rail. It's like being soft on crime in a lot of people's minds. If and the debate, unfortunately, always focuses on extreme cases. The Lake and Riley Act was based on an extreme case, but for those who believe in the replacement theory and want to make sure there are as few new immigrants coming to this country as possible, they take the extreme case, and then but it of course ends up applying more broadly. And so but it's so complicated to get into some of the weeds of immigration law itself. There's obviously an overlay with criminal law, and but what the survey data shows us is, as you say, a lot of older APIs are historically more law and order oriented, which is understandable. And when we saw it when the COVID pandemic was rampant and people were feeling targeted, and it's a natural, I think, instinct to want to be safe, of course. And so what we have to make sure that we do is not let that very valid viewpoint be exploited, and for our community to become a wedge issue on something that clearly positive, expansive immigration policy has always been to our benefit as a community. but it's being hidden by these other more sensational issues and concerns. So I think again, uh, for our community, for a organization like ours, we definitely are going to stress the importance of birthright citizenship, the importance of naturalizing to get your citizenship, and clearly people, once they get their green card, they feel like they've made it, and it might be understandable because with a green card you have many more rights than with a temporary work visa or whatever other legal status you can have, not to mention if somebody was undocumented. But that green card, which we're seeing now, doesn't really protect you from a capricious enforcement policy. And then even citizens, are potentially swept up in this overzealous enforcement regime. So I think it really, but in order to connect with the community, it has to be much more straightforward and explained in a way that makes sense as to why this is going to help you, not the greater good, but why it's going to help you. And I think that's what we need to focus on as well. So that's what we'll be working towards, that sort of education as we move to the next big election cycle.
Sure. Sounds like a lot of work ahead. Karthik, I want to bring you into this conversation. Of course, immigration has been an area of expertise for you forever. We've also had several folks in the chat asking some questions about, can you tell us a little bit more about where these numbers particularly around the Filipinos might be coming from? If you have any ideas about that, certainly if Bob and Greg want to jump in and chime in on that as well, that's great. But Karthik, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. And I'd say just on that last question about immigration, and one of the questions that was asked is, Filipinos are predominantly immigrant community. By the way, when it comes to undocumented immigrants in the Filipino community, at least the estimates from Pew Research Center is less than 150,000, whereas their estimates for Indian Americans is much higher, at over 700,000. So that might account for a little bit of that disconnect, that the issue of undocumented immigration is less salient in the Filipino community than and then in, say, the South Asian or the Indian American community. More generally, though, my inclination is to, first of all, give credit, if you will, to a particular kind of political persuasion involving not just Donald Trump, but also the governors of Florida and Texas that brought immigration to the doorstep. Kind of, they made it a crisis for local governance on issues relating to not just labor markets, but public safety, housing, and to create media spectacles that that was challenging to governors and mayors in blue cities and blue states. So that, I think, is part of it. And also, more generally, when you have either conditions or perceptions of scarcity, people tend to be less generous, even if they were immigrants themselves. That they conclude that this is not the time for us to be generous. So I think that's going to be really important to be able to not only have conversations with community, but to come up with an economic agenda and a political agenda that gets away from scarcity, right? And that does create more opportunities, but that also enables people to think of both the short-term and the long-term consequences. And this is where I would say, let's go beyond immigration here, right? When it comes to education, the kinds of things that are happening right now in terms of disinvesting in higher education is something that will harm not only our communities, API communities, but that will harm the country in the medium to long term. But we don't have the time and space to even have that conversation, right? It's just a flurry of activity, not only by the week, but seemingly by the day. So that these radical shifts that are occurring on matters of policy without much thoughtfulness or consideration in terms of what the implications are. Particularly when it comes to Filipinos, at least, I mean, from partners that work with Filipino populations, what we've heard in the past are different factors, including, connection with a lot of Filipino Americans with the military, but also conservative, like Filipino American communities are split on issues of strongman politics in their homeland, for example. And soft or maybe in stronger support for authoritarianism if it means that you have someone who gets things done and break through whatever log jams and the inconveniences of the messy world of democratic politics. So that might be at play. I think potentially progressives and Democrats have not been as strong when it comes to faith-based outreach. So that might be an opening or an opportunity or a need for those who are working on immigrant rights to make sure that they're expanding the circle of who that they're talking to educate and to persuade.
No, I think that's great, right? Like we don't necessarily know one causal reason why Filipinos might have this kind of turn, but I think you laid out some really great ideas. This piece around that there's simply not as many undocumented within the community, faith-based outreach, military, and as well as this strongman politics, and that they may be supporting in their home countries, which I think are all fascinating sort of rationales for why we might be seeing this trend, particularly amongst Filipinos. I wanted to, in that we don't have a whole lot of time left, I know that there's a question also about APIs in the Midwest, if we have any information about the number or percentage of APIs that tend to come from many of these other states. Ohio, Indiana, Michigan in particular were mentioned, but I might also add in there, of course, we have expanding populations of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in places like Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Arizona, Nevada. Karthik or Greg or Bob, would either of you like to weigh in on, I don't know if you have specific percentages, or if you want to share a little bit about some of your work, perhaps, that you've had in some of these other states outside of California?
Well, I'll leave the data questions to Karthik, but I will say certainly geographical considerations is a big part of what we think about in NCAPA. Even from a policy perspective, understanding that the lived experiences of Asian American, Native and Pacific Islanders on the West Coast and East Coast are just going to be different. And that's not to say it's better or worse, it just simply is, right? And one thing Karthik mentioned really certainly resonates with me, this idea that just this rapid disinvestment that we're seeing across government, the implications of which I think are far deeper than many people realize. I think even for us who are working in it, we have a speculative idea of just how harmful it's going to be, but we're not going to know until it really takes hold, right? Like, I think everyone, also, I'll just speak for myself. It's like if you're trying to get in shape, you don't just do a crash diet and expect the results to necessarily be not disruptive. It's oftentimes we're warned that it's unhealthy. We're essentially doing that to the federal government. You cannot take hundreds of billions of dollars out of agencies, shut them down, and expect there not to be massive, consequences across the country. And so I do think people really, our job is to make sure people understand the impact of that. And one thing NCAP is working on as a collective is a 100-day report. The first 100 days of the Trump administration, everything that they've done from different executive orders, different decisions across just about every policy area, and really trying to use the work that API Data, APIAVote, and AJ have done to sort of ground it in the community so that there's a real understanding and at least baseline analysis of what the impact will likely be. And so I really want to stress that to folks, and I imagine most of the folks on this webinar understand that. But we cannot understate just how harmful this will be if we continue on this track.
Bob, did you want to weigh in at all on this question around
I'll defer to Karthik.
Sure.
So what was the second question, Sarah?
Well, the first part was if you have data on the numbers of folks.
Oh,
like
so on the Midwest, yeah, we won't be able to break that out on Midwest and South, but what I would say kind of, yeah, California is about a third, and then you have Texas and New York that kind of come in, right? Depending on how you you count the population. In the past, what we have seen is that API in our surveys with APIAVote, where we have larger sample, that Asian Americans who live in red states do hold more conservative opinion, but it's still, I mean, you go from like a 2-to-1 ratio, say, when it comes to presidential voting patterns, to something that looks like a 50-50 split when you look at those in red states. And then in purple states, it's somewhere in between those two. So I think the key thing there is that if you compare Asian Americans to the general population, if you take into account geography, you still see a more kind of leftward tilt among Asian Americans than in the general population, certainly than among white voters. One of the questions was, what can be done other than education, when it comes to when it comes to reaching out to community and kind of having them understand the consequences. I think right now, especially, I mean, this is related to partisan politics, even though the organizations that Greg and Bob and others are talking about are all C3 nonpartisan organizations. Access to those in power matters. So when you don't have Democrats, I mean, we heard from Congresswoman Meng, it'll be very different if community organizations are going to members of Congress and KPAC if Democrats control the House. But Democrats do not control the House. So there's very little they can do. And there's a fair amount of frustration among community organizations and even among the electorate wanting Congress to do more. But short of shutting everything down, which maybe we will get there when it comes to the budget or the debt ceiling or other matters, there, unfortunately, given the way, fortunately, I guess, depending on one's perspective, there's not much that those who oppose major planks of these agenda can do outside of the court system right now. But there are big budget questions to be had. And you see a fair number of Republicans that are hearing from their constituents, especially when it comes to proposed cuts to Medicaid. And that affects our population as well. I guess this is where I'll end, is that we have a lot of resources on our site and by the numbers when it comes to economic hardship, when it comes to education, when it comes to immigration. I would encourage you all to check those resources out, but also don't take it for granted that just because our community is adversely affected by an issue, that it means that they will rise up to defend those interests. And it does take mobilization and activation to make sure that our community's needs are being addressed. And so many of the NCAPA member organizations do that work every day. It is a challenging funding environment, and I hope that funders recognize the importance of doing this work so that we don't take our communities for granted when they're adversely affected by various issues.
Perfect. And I think that's a pretty uplifting note to to leave us on, that in addition to education, there's so much motivation and mobilization that needs to occur, and that no doubt there's a ton of community organizations throughout the nation that are doing that work as we speak. I want to thank everybody. We are at the hour, so thank everyone for joining us today. Thank you for your engagement and participation in the briefing and for your continued support. Continue to stay up to date on these latest findings at AAPI Data and the AP NORC websites. And as always, feel free to reach out with any questions. Thank you so much and have a great day.